Hello ladies and gentlemen, Gavesty here. This is the DPS guide for Mythic Brackenspore. So DPS on this fight have quite a lot on their plate to think about. There are a number of new mechanics, well, two actually, not that many, but they add just enough extra chaos along with all the requirements that you'll need to think about for the Mythic changes, that there's just a ton of stuff going on. Perhaps most importantly, it's a long fight when you're first progressing on this. So you can expect to be pretty close to the Berserk timer, 9 or so minutes at least, before you actually get them down. And that can be a long fight this early into the actual raid zone, where you're used to the in-boss fights actually taking that long. Now, first things first, we'll talk about the new abilities on Mythic. Those are Call of the Tides and Exploding Fungus. So we're going to see Call of the Tides happen just in a moment here. And this is one of the two new special abilities which occur randomly every 20 seconds. They'll either be Call of the Tides or Exploding Fungus. You'll never know which it is. So Call of the Tides creates waves that come from the water, of course, and will cross the room. So here you can see the waves. When these spawn, they will form a series of gaps. And the way these gaps can be formed is essentially one large gap in the middle, like you just saw, or two small gaps on either side. So you would have wave on the left, then a gap, wave in the middle, gap, and then a wave on the right. So it's important to keep in mind when these are spawning that these two sequences can occur. Generally speaking, it's going to be a large gap in the middle or two smaller gaps in either side. So, of course, your raid can communicate this as other people see them spawn in case you don't see them. One important thing to note about Call of the Tides is that the distance, the draw distance of the waves is not very long, or not very far away from you. So there will often be cases where the Call of the Tides will happen. Your boss mods or recoil will go off and you'll know it's happening, but the waves won't be drawn on your screen. You won't see where they are for quite some time. This can be particularly dangerous if you're close to the water for some reason. So if you're doing Flamethrower, for example, or your raid has to be positioned near there because of a helpful mushroom that's over there, whatever it is, be very aware of when these are spawning that you play it safe. You can even back yourself up slightly away from the water just for a couple seconds until you confirm that you're in a safe gap between the waves before moving back. If you do happen to get hit by a wave, it does pretty significant damage to you. It won't probably kill most people if they're full health, but it does do enough damage with other damage. If you've taken a hit from a spore shooter or infesting spore tick or anything like that, it's going to kill you. So obviously you want to avoid it at all costs. The other special ability is Exploding Fungus. This will create a series of very tiny mushrooms out from the ground in random locations over about 6-second period. And they will spawn sort of slowly. So some will spawn right away as the ability begins, and others will spawn right near the end. After the entire 6-second cast, all the mushrooms will explode simultaneously in a very small radius, about 3 yards around them. So in other words, if you're touching a mushroom, you're standing on top of one, you will get hit by the explosion, but if you're not, you'll be safe. The best thing you can do, of course, is to play it safe. Make sure you can clearly see the ground around your own feet, and if you have to, move away from other targets. This is particularly important if you're in melee range, which often occurs, like you see there, stacking up for doing DPS, or you're just inside a mushroom or something. You want to play it safe and back away during the exploding fungus spawns. That way you can clearly see around your own character. You're not hindered by other players or the feet of the boss even, which are quite large, and they can cover up the mushrooms and whatnot. Once you know that it's safe in your position, there's nothing there, and the explosion's gone off, then you're free to move back into whatever spot you need to be in. So that's the best advice for handling that mechanic. Generally speaking, though, we found Exploding Fungus is far easier to deal with repeatedly, and because it's random, either that or the Call of the Tides, sometimes you'll just get far more Call of the Tides that you have to dodge, and these require you to move a lot, whereas the Exploding Fungus generally doesn't require you to move very much. Now, other than concentrating on your own survival, as a DPS, probably the most important thing you can really be constantly thinking about in this fight is your DPS targets and the priority that's required. So at the top there you can see the rough priority that you want to focus on mobs. An important note, of course, is Brackenspore's at the end. Everything else, generally speaking, is more important than him. So the first up is Mind Fungus if it is spawned in the melee pack. So this means, of course, if you are just keeping Brackenspore in one position, he's not moving around, and a fungus spawns right underneath him in melee, you got to kill him right away, because otherwise this haste is going to really reduce damage from anyone that's in melee, particularly melee DPS, of course, but often this is casters and healers as well, if you're stacked up for something. If the Mind Fungus is not in melee, then it's later in the priority, as I'll talk about in a moment. Next up is Spore Shooters. I'll talk about how to handle these in a moment, but pretty much if there's not a Mind Fungus that immediately needs to be killed, Spore Shooters are it. This is really the crux of the fight for most DPS players. If you handle Spore Shooters properly and survive, you avoid the avoidable damage, that's it. The fight will go 10 minutes and either you'll have enough DPS and you'll win, or you'll hit Berserk and you won't. But that's really the key. Third is the Fungal Flesh Eater. The slower this thing dies, the longer it's alive, the higher its stack count and the more damage it will do. And on Mythic, this damage is severe. It can really kill your tanks quickly. Now you can make up for this with very strong tanks, very strong healing, all that good stuff. But generally speaking, if there aren't Spore Shooters to kill, you should be attacking the Fungal Flesh Eater. Obviously, this is a fight that really lends itself well to dots and all that good stuff. And this target, the Fungal Flesh Eater, is alive a long time, so really take advantage of that so you can get damage on it, plus Brackenspore, plus any other adds that might survive long enough, all that good stuff. Next up, we have the Mind Fungus if it is out of melee. So in this case, what you essentially have is a situation where your ranged are spread out for whatever reason, and a Mind Fungus spawns on one random person somewhere. In this case, that person or the few people that are near it simply move away. The radius that it will reduce haste is not very large, and as long as you move out of that radius, you're no longer debuffed by it, and it just doesn't do anything if you're not close to it. So in that case, you still want to kill it, but you don't want to focus it. So I put this as fourth in the list. It's not really fourth for most DPS, but it's a way to think about it. If the Mind Fungus is not in melee, it's not a super high priority at the time, use dot classes. So if you have heavy dots, throw up a dot on it, or a dot or two, and otherwise just focus on the priority targets that are actually active. And that'll just slowly die over time since it's not doing anything. So here's one right there. You can see one spawn just on me, and you're one other person, I think. So we're not focusing on it. It's just going to be dotted slowly, and it'll die over time. And then, of course, lastly is Brackenspore. If he doesn't die, the fight never ends and all that good stuff. The only time this priority really should change, outside of specific, strategy changes that your raid may have, is right at the very end. The Berserk is going to come up about 2 minutes or so after the last Flesh Eater spawn, and that Flesh Eater just simply wouldn't be killable before the Berserk happens, or it might be, but it would happen at the same time, and you don't really care about it that time. So probably in the last 2 minutes of the fight or so, you're just going to want to ignore the Flesh Eater entirely. There's no purpose in attacking it because it's not going to die, and therefore it won't reduce the damage that the tanks take in that period. So as mentioned, the real key to this fight is DPS and management of the Spore Shooters. So let's talk about a few tips for this. Probably the most important thing to consider is that the shots from the Spore Shooters will do damage to the target that they hit, as well as players around that target in a short radius. Because of this, you can actually prevent a lot of this damage by either interrupting the casts or intercepting the actual bolt. It obeys line of sight, so to speak, in that if it hits a player that it doesn't actually target, it will instead hit the player that intercepted it. So you see here a series of clips where I'm just running up next to Spore Shooters, by myself, getting between them and the rest of the raid, and therefore soaking up the shot that's trying to hit someone else on myself. This means that it only hits one person instead of a massive number of people. The damage taken to the raid as a whole is much lower. If every Spore shooter is only hitting one person, or even half that if they're silenced or interrupted, it just does so little damage compared to if everyone's stacked up. If people don't get in front of these shots or interrupt them in some way, and the raid is stacked up for another purpose, like getting healing from the living mushroom, the raid will wipe almost instantly. It's just over. So getting used to this idea is going to be critical as a DPS to help out the raid. Obviously, this mostly applies to ranged DPS, and of course healers, which I'm doing here. But melee can do it if there's a Spore shooter near enough to engage without losing too much DPS time on the fungal flesh eater. Then melee absolutely can move over to a Spore shooter and help out, and it will just greatly benefit everyone. The important thing to note is because the shot is an AE hit, if multiple people are standing in front of one trying to soak it up, that doesn't really help. It should only be one person per Spore shooter, since otherwise you're just getting double the damage or whatnot. So basic tips, like I said, interrupt, silence the casts. They're very fast casts, but interrupting once will often be enough to finish the Spore shooter off if DPS are killing them quickly before it casts again. Of course, stand in near melee between it and the rest of the raid to soak the shots, and if possible, use a personal cooldown when you need to. So if you get low health because you've taken a couple shots without healing, or particularly during a combination of infesting spores where most of the raid is supposed to stack up inside the living mushroom, in this case, like you see here, you can use a personal cooldown of some kind and stay out, continuing to soak the Spore shooter if it doesn't die right away, which will sometimes be the case. Now, another really important thing to focus on, particularly for melee DPS, is the fungal flesh eater's interrupts. And obviously, just like in normal and heroic, these are cast frequently enough that it requires at least 2 different sources of interrupts to be able to cover all the casts. However, unlike normal and heroic, Mythic has one extra ability that will really make this difficult for only 2 people, and that is Call the Tides, as you see here. So the reason that this is a problem is because Call the Tides, of course, forces position changes rapidly without warning, and this means that the tank that's tanking the Flesh Eater, along with the rest of the raid, of course, are going to have to move to avoid the waves. What this often means is, particularly if you're interrupting as a melee DPS, which is usually the case, you will have trouble keeping up with the fungal flesh eater at times. If it moves away from you in the wrong direction that you weren't expecting, or it moves at an awkward time, or the tank doesn't move quickly enough and you move out, all that good stuff. The timing is such that decay will happen during those waves, and you will miss it if you are trying to stay in melee to interrupt. So a couple solutions, of course, are to have the ability to self-cool down such that you can soak the wave and stay in a position to get the interrupt. But even then, that doesn't adjust for the movement issues. Sometimes if the boss has just moved at the wrong time, just as the cast is happening, and you are out of range at the moment, you might miss it. It takes a little bit of luck and near perfect play for 2 people alone to get all the interrupts in Mythic. So what really helped us a lot is to simply have 4 people do it. 2 pairs of 2 people each will take turns interrupting, just as if it was the original 2 people only taking turns. But this way you have a backup. So even if it's all melee, it's completely fine because you always have 2 people trying, and usually one or the other, if not both, most of the times, will be interrupting the cast. So that helps a lot. The other option is if you are a ranged player with a ranged interrupt, so shamans are a great example of this, then you can help out with this as well, and maybe not necessarily need 4 people on it. So obviously just work this out with the other DPS, but this will be a primary thing you have to focus on if you are one of those interrupt members. Last but not least, of course, we have flamethrowers. So again, these exist just like on normal heroic, except on Mythic, you actually get 3 flamethrowers, 3 guns, so that 3 different people can use them if so desired. Now what we found actually worked best, believe it or not, is to only really utilize 2 or arguably 2 and some change of those guns. So we would have 2 primary flamethrower DPS, in our case 2 Moonkins, but Hunters work great as well. Really any strong player that has a ranged DPS can do it and make good use of it. The main idea here is that those 2 players will each get opposite ends of the room and get the majority of the creep or moss throughout the fight. The 3rd player is not really focusing on doing too much with the flamethrower and will spend most of his or her time focusing on DPS just like any other player. However, the 3rd player is watching for any moss that creeps into a bad location where the raid needs to move right away, where one of the other people may not be there to get. So, for example, if there's moss that's coming up near the boss or near a living mushroom that you're moving toward or something like that, this 3rd player can just quickly swoop in there and get it since they'll be close to the raid at all times. So the last thing, of course, is the actual technique, how you burn the moss using the flamethrower. If you do this properly, after some practice, you can actually get your burning infusion stacks to infinitely increase until you hit the max, which is 30. And your damage will go through the roof if you do this properly. So the first thing, of course, is you need a macro. /click, space extra action button 1. And this will just allow you to hit the button rather than having to actually click with your mouse to turn it on and off. This will save you a lot of a headache, essentially. Outside of that, the actual technique that you're going to want to use is to find positions that are touching 3 other moss, essentially. So here you can see a top-down diagram that sort of represents that. Moss spawns in, on a grid-based pattern, essentially, even though it doesn't quite look like it, but it's in squares, grid squares. So in this diagram, you'd be positioned in the empty square in the bottom left, the white square. And then you'd be touching 3 patches of moss, one to the top right, and one to the right. Now, what you want to do is in this position, you start on one of the far sides, far right in this case. You activate by hitting your hotkey, your macro, facing that right one. And during the global cooldown, you're spamming your macro to turn it off as soon as the global cooldown is up, which I think is about a second or a second and a half. And meanwhile, during that global cooldown, while it's activated, you start from that right side and you spin to the left quickly, and you will burn at least 3 patches since you're touching these 3. And then as soon as the global's over, it will turn off. And once it's off, you've now burned 3 patches using the minimum energy required to do so. If you actually position even like touching almost the moss itself, like get up in that corner, you can sometimes even burn more than 3, but 3 is the idea. If you do at least 3 every time, your burning infusion stack will go up always, because you will not use more energy burning it than you'd essentially gain by getting more burning infusion stacks because of the time that your energy actually regens. So you can kind of see the damage meters in the bottom right. Our 2 druids that are doing this are miles ahead of the rest of the DPS. This is how it's supposed to be. And like I said, one of our druids was able to get up to the max 30 stacks by the end of the fight, and it just does an insane amount of damage. So this technique will really help you a lot once you get get practiced with it, essentially. Of course, the other important thing is to make sure you're positioned properly relative to the rest of the raid, particularly Brackenspore. This is doubly important because of the position requirements for the Call of the Tides waves. So early on when we were learning this, we had some issues where one of our flamethrower people would move out, say toward the water in particular, just as the waves are coming in. And because the waves don't always appear on the screen right away, you can sort of get caught out and be in position where you can't escape. So make sure you play it safe if you're doing the flamethrower, especially if you're assigned to the water side of the room, and watch where the waves are going to spawn, back up a little if necessary, until you're certain that you're safe, and then you can move forward. Again, the key is as long as you don't go to absolutely 0 energy so you haven't used your flamethrower in a while, or you don't cap it out. If you're doing the 3 patches per cycle technique, getting rid of the moss, you'll always gain stacks. So you can use time in between that as necessary to dodge stuff or do DPS to the ads or the boss or whatever. So that should really cover it for the DPS guide for Mythic Brackenspore. Outside of special roles like flamethrower stuff, most of it is going to be familiar compared to the heroic version. The main thing, of course, is getting used to dodging the new mechanics, the waves and the exploding mushrooms, and being really on the ball with helping to position yourself and soak up the spore shooter shots, of course switching to them right away, dealing with the mind fungus when necessary, and focusing your damage on the flesh eater more so than Brackenspore himself. If you can help out with all those things and increase the raid survivability while doing, of course, standard DPS stuff, the fight will come together very quickly. So, like I said, most of this fight is really all about the DPS, focusing on the spore shooters and getting them down quickly and efficiently and soaking the damage and all that good stuff. So, that should do it for Mythic Brackenspore DPS. As always, thanks for watching, good luck, and I'll see you next time.